Welcome to Brew Kombucha. This is your guide to growing your own SCOBY. So in my previous video on how to acquire a SCOBY, I talk a bit about why I don't really recommend growing your own SCOBY from a bottle of kombucha that you buy at the store. And my reasoning behind that is largely because a lot of store-bought kombucha brands process their kombucha in ways that are not as pure as homemade kombucha is. Whether they admit to it or not, brands that say that their kombucha is raw and unflavored may actually be pasteurized and may have other ingredients that are not present in a home brew. The truth is that even though the label on that kombucha bottle says that it's raw and unflavored, they may add yeast inhibitors, they might dilute that kombucha, and they may actually pasteurize it to prevent the bottle from continuing to ferment at the store, which is a reasonable thing for a commercial kombucha producer to do. But when you're making homemade kombucha, you don't need to worry about any of all that. So homemade kombucha is 9 times out of 10 gonna be way more pure than anything that you buy off the supermarket shelf. But I have gotten a lot of questions from homebrewers who are curious about growing their own SCOBY and don't just want to buy one from an online source or get one from a friend. So I decided to put it to the test. Could I successfully grow a SCOBY from a bottle of readily accessible store-bought kombucha? And the answer actually is yes, you can. So the process actually took about 7 weeks from start to finish, and all I did was I took a plain, raw, unflavored bottle of kombucha that I got from the store, and I put it in a mason jar. And then I covered it with a cotton cloth similar to the type of cotton cloth that I usually use to brew my batches of kombucha, and then I just left it in a corner of my living room. That's literally all I did. You might see some sites out there that recommend adding more tea and more sugar to that kombucha to give the starter tea something to eat, and that's fine. I didn't find it necessary for my purposes just because I wanted the kombucha to ferment and concentrate on its own before I diluted it with anything else like sweet tea. And it worked out just fine. So after about 7 weeks, the 2 cups that I started with actually concentrated down to just a cup of liquid. And I got a SCOBY that was around 3/4 of an inch in thickness that I then used both SCOBY and starter tea to brew a half-gallon batch of kombucha. I will note that you don't really have to wait 7 weeks until that starter tea is concentrated and acidic enough for you to use it in a batch of kombucha. Most people recommend just waiting about a month or so, but I really wanted to make sure that that starter tea was as strong and as fermented as possible before I introduced it to a batch of kombucha, just to make sure that I was setting it up for success and I wasn't leaving it up to chance to see if it was gonna acidify things properly. So I do wanna remind you, when I say leave it alone in a corner, for a few weeks, I do mean leave it alone. Because I was super curious about the process, I ended up kind of peeking under the cotton cloth to see how it was progressing, and I actually caused my SCOBY formation to sink down to the bottom. So as I've mentioned in other videos, it doesn't really matter if your SCOBY formation sinks, but it did make it harder for me to know whether or not it was fermenting properly. So I ended up leaving it a couple weeks longer than I really wanted to, just to make sure that that SCOBY, the new SCOBY growth on top could get nice and thick. If you want to see the step-by-step process of me actually growing my kombucha SCOBY, I took a bunch of photos as I was doing it. If you're on Instagram, you can search for the hashtag #YBKGrowsASCOBY, no spaces, and you'll see all the photos that I took as I was growing my SCOBY. So I can affirm that if you do want to grow your own SCOBY, this is a perfectly viable way to do it. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. You can always find way more resources and tips and tricks at youbrewkombucha.com. And if you're on Instagram and you're not already following me, go ahead and follow me. Happy brewing!